So in the second episode, we have on Turtles All the Way Down, Jesse Hirsh. My name is Jake, or sometimes Jank. We had Jesse Hirsh come in here to my space in the Junction on a very hot, kind of a heat wave day in the afternoon. And this is part of an ongoing experimentation to see what process works best to have enjoyable podcast episodes for you. And we didn't really have it figured out at this point, in that what I've done since then is to essentially have a rationalized process by which people come to the neighborhood. We sit down for breakfast at our local Greasy Spoon, which happens to be, in this case, the Purple Onion. We have breakfast. We kind of get to know each other, or get a sense of, talking and the pacing, etc. And then we walk over to my space, which I've set up my little home studio, and we have a conversation. Now, the space that we're in, maybe it's good if you can visualize it. It is in a neighborhood called the Junction in Toronto, and it's called the Junction because several rail lines merge, and there's rail yards just north of this neighborhood here, where a lot of trains are coming and going. And in the old days, it used to be a area where a lot of the railroad workers would stop. There were several taverns and hotels nearby, and they would drink a lot and get drunk and run around the streets and fight and public urination, what have you. So what happened was, and this was around 100 years ago, perhaps even more, the local residents decided to make this area a dry area, meaning that no alcohol was allowed at all. And so they had this one last day of bacchanalia where everybody knew it was the last day, that there was going to be booze in the Junction, and everyone took the streetcars down to this neighborhood, and it was, by all accounts, an insane day of revelry, drinking, yelling, breaking glass, etc. And since that day, it took almost another 100 years for this neighborhood to cease being dry. And since having merged with the city of Toronto many, many years ago, City Council decided that it was enough, and that people can start serving alcohol in this neighborhood again. So what happened since then is that, and it was soon after that I actually moved into the neighborhood, which was about 12, 13 years ago. And what happened right after that is, some bars started opening up, some restaurants, some nicer places to eat that have some, good glass of wine or beer. And even more recently, we've had a couple of microbreweries. There's Junction Brewery. There's also the Indie Ale House, just has a restaurant and brewery in one space down the street. But the space I'm in actually used to be one of the first Loblaw stores. And if you're familiar with Canadian retail establishments, Loblaws is kind of one of the largest grocery retailers in the country. And there was a Mr. Loblaws. And this was one of his early stores in the late 20s, as I understand it. And it's kind of a big, clear span, open space that used to be a small grocery store of about 3,000 square feet. Not very large by today's standards, but seemed to be the size that these stores were back then. And there's kind of a mezzanine loft area, which used to be Mr. Loblaw's office, which is now currently my bedroom. And I sleep where I imagined that he would have had his desk and did some of his work and planning. And the safe that he had is now my nightstand beside my bed. I don't actually know what the combination is, so it just stays open all the time and unlocked. Now, this space, when I got it, used to be kind of a, after Loblaws, it was a Goodwill store. So with a Goodwill store, you have a lot of people dropping off donations of like shoes and old clothes and toys and sporting equipment, golf clubs, etc. And they would drop it off for a charitable donation, and then the Goodwill store would sell it and collect the proceeds for charities. And I guess that went on into the 50s or 60s, thereabouts. And then there was a family that opened up a store after Goodwill left, and they called it Goodwell Recycling Center. I don't think it's kind of accidental that they made it sound like that. And the great business model for this is that people just kept dropping off donations. And this family would essentially have a store that would sell these things. So essentially they would get their inventory for free and sell them, and it's a for-profit venture, but I guess most people just assume that because it's taking in donations and selling things that it's probably not for profit, but it was. And this kind of continued for a while until I purchased a building from that family. And that was in 2004, and what I did was completely gutted the space. I mean, took it right down to its bricks and discovered that there's a triple brick thick detached building. In front of that, we put in some insulation, some drywall, very few windows, kind of a big open loft experience here. But what that also does is the way it's constructed, it's very private, it's very quiet. When you've got all the windows closed and you've got music going, you know, the neighbors don't actually hear much of what's going on in here. So we can have parties here, and we do. We occasionally have, you know, whether it's a Halloween party or a May 2-4 weekend or a large birthday party for a friend. We get a collection of DJs together, and every hour we switch it up and we have some music played in here. We're going to have, quite soon, I think, a stand-up comedy nights in here, and get some local comedians in here working on their art and craft in this space. The other thing that goes on in here is podcasts. And Turtles All the Way Down is being recorded here. And the way we've got it set up here is essentially we're sitting around and talking over antique laboratory tables from an Ontario science lab. And surrounding these antique lab tables are a bunch of art on the wall. And most of this art came from the events that went on in this space. So at the front of the building, I left about 800 square feet when I got this place 12 years ago. And I allowed artists to use that space, whether for a weekend or a week or a month, kind of like pop-up gallery shows. We had opening night parties, etc. And instead of asking for rent from these artists, I essentially asked for a piece of art to be left behind. And so the wall is adorned with these works, of which I guess 90% of them come from that route. So I get a free art collection that way, essentially. And what's happened in the neighborhood, I think, since then is that a lot of people were coming here for the art shows, and for them it was often their first time that they'd come to the Junction, and they'd be surprised by the neighborhood, as was I when I first got in here. It was kind of an odd collection of weird stores that were hardly ever open, some vacant stores, some stores that had just plants inside and looked like somebody lived in there. You had some old cash registers or appliances in the windows of some stores, and it wasn't quite clear what was going on. And there was a lot of, you know, late night street prostitution. There were massage parlors. It was kind of known for that, apparently. And then slowly over time, all of these have slipped away, and we've got the natural progression of what some might call gentrification. So we have these nice restaurants, wine bars. We have a, you know, like artisanal chocolate and ice cream shop and cheese shops and organic grocery stores and, you know, those sort of things popping up. And I guess the fear is that this is kind of a pattern that we've seen played out in many neighborhoods in Toronto as well. And the last one that I can think of is Queen West, which was kind of the hub of the arts for many years, but as can be expected, pretty soon became unaffordable for all those artists that were kind of adding the zest and life to the neighborhood. So some of them, I think, started moving into the Junction once they were exposed to the idea that you can also have art. It's a little bit further west out of the downtown core, but not as far as you might think. Transit's pretty decent, bicycle ride of a few minutes extra, and you're here. And so what's happened and since then is that I've been thinking of ways that I can even expand this space. So I've got some ambitious plans, I guess, but they're nebulous and they're not concrete. And I plan this way and that way, and eventually something takes shapes. But what I'm thinking is utilizing the space more as an art space, and I mean that in the most general sense. So whether it's music or visual art or filmmaking or comedy or what have you, or a place for discussions, we have a place where people can gather and talk and play. And with that in mind, I over the last couple of years have had what we've called Sunday salons. Essentially kind of like an open house on Sundays where you never really know who's going to drop by, although there was often the cast of more or less the same characters that came most of the time. And those were great. And we've had fewer of them recently as a lot of the participants have gone on to other cities or other projects, or they're busy with their own art. But a lot of ideas were hatched here, and a lot of enthusiastic, positive reinforcement was given to the people with some of these creative ideas. And I like to think that it spurred on some creativity, and so I hope to continue to do that. Well, part of it is this podcast. And and this being the second one, I guess I'm in the monologue here, speaking with you, trying to fill you in on what the environment is in this space if you haven't been here before. And who knows, someday you might be attending one of the events that happen here to give you a feel for it. We had our guest, Jesse Hirsh. You might be very familiar with him if you're in Canada. He is the go-to guy, essentially, at CBC when you have some need for an enlightened expert communicator who could come on either the newscast on TV or on the radio programs on CBC 1 and 2. And you'd get Jesse to basically talk about whatever was happening in the world of technology and culture. And his background is from the McLuhan Institute at the University of Toronto, where a lot of interesting things are concocted, thought about, written about, and talked about. And it was, as the name would suggest, has a lot to do with the influence of Marshall McLuhan. So always interesting to listen and talk with Jesse. It being kind of a hot afternoon, I feel like I maybe didn't say as much as I would have liked. It's like after the conversation, after my zombie effect wears off, I think, I should have said that, or I should have said this. Some interesting ideas came out, but we'll develop them over the upcoming podcasts with other people, because I found myself in subsequent podcasts referring to some of the things that Jesse said, despite the fact that I didn't seem to jump on them at the moment. So we get into, discussions about singularity and artificial intelligence and all of these things that I seem to be coming back to more and more, kind of this notion of a superintelligence that we are building. And I think what Jesse would say that we've already built. I like to think that, it's kind of a gray area. It's kind of hard to say. It depends on how you define it, whether it's already here or about to be here or in its birthing stages. We'll get into that, and you'll get a sense of what we're talking about. Good conversation. I hope you enjoy it. Jesse Hirsh on Turtles All the Way Down. Talk soon. You're one of these guys that I kind of relish talking with, because it seems like the subject matters would be pretty much infinite, and we can probably spend hours on tangents. And so just a while before you came, I thought, well, how do we even start to organize this? And I thought, I'm going to try this. I'm going to throw out basically an iconic company name and then see what kind of conversation that spurs. And I think it's going to probably spur some conversation in the fields that you're doing currently research in, which, as I saw in a Facebook post, recently had to do with algorithms. And that was probably the first time I'd seen you on Facebook in years, and kind of reconnected us. So the first iconic company, Facebook. What pops into your head when you think of that? And What's going on there?
Monopoly. The extent to which Facebook is competing to be, I mean, they already are a monopoly when it comes to identity, but their ambitions, their appetite is so incredible, and it's really using algorithms as their engine. I mean, one of the things in my research that I started with is what is an algorithm? And on a technical level, it's really just a recipe for sorting data. But as someone who's studied McLuhan, I don't think of media as tools. I think of media as culture. And I think of the way that media as a culture really frames the way we experience the world. So in that sense, Facebook is about algorithmic culture, the way in which they're changing everyone's culture, changing how we relate to our friends, changing how we hear about news and politics. And it's all done through the algorithm, whether it's trending topics, whether it's the stuff you might see in your news feed. So it's a profound political economic shift, both in terms of who's making money, Facebook, but also in terms of how we're perceiving the world. And in that respect, Facebook has a growing kind of political power that I'm not sure any empire has previously been able to achieve.
Now, do you think there's some kind of a nefarious plan in place? Is somebody planning these or outlining what to do with this information in a sense that's beyond just making more money? Is there something else going on?
I mean, the short answer is yes. It's not sinister. It's not some conspiracy. But there is a kind of utopian drive to what Facebook and other Silicon Valley entrepreneurs are doing. I mean, they see themselves as changing the world. Granted, they perceive it as in a positive way. But I think one of the benefits or one of the empowering aspects of algorithms is it is designed to empower us, to give us the information we need to inform us about the world, to connect us with friends. So I think on the one level, there is a kind of political project at work, an innocent, a naive political project in which they really think that they're making everyone's lives better. But it is kind of like unleashing the genie. I mean, you get three wishes, but those three wishes never work out the way you intend them.
That's right.
And I think algorithm is a kind of genie. It gives us a kind of power, but at what cost? At what expense?
You know, back in the early 90s when I was getting a little involved in the tech business, I remember when I first heard about Google coming onto the scene, and that word algorithm just kind of popped into parlance right around that time when people started saying, well, Google, their whole thing is about this search algorithm that they're doing, that they're using, and that was the genius of it that launched it and gave them their power. And it wasn't too long after that people started to get into all these dystopian scenarios about what could happen when somebody especially when it comes to a monopolized situation. Google is obviously clearly one that we could talk about. Their whole thing is based on algorithms, and what are they doing with algorithms?
Well, they're expanding quite rapidly. I mean, what once was a search company is now an algorithmic company, an AI company. And it's everything from healthcare to trying to find a cure for cancer, trying to defeat aging, whether it's, you know, the degeneration of the brain to the breakdown of the body. But one of the examples I cite in my research that, as an anecdote, really illustrates Google's power is what they're doing to fight extremists. I mean, social media companies, internet companies have come under incredible pressure from industrialized nations to not enable extremism, to not allow, for example, the Islamic State, which has been very successful at recruiting foreign fighters using social media. So a lot of these companies are facing pressure from governments to, at the very least, not enable it, if not actively help them fight extremism. So in the United Kingdom, Google's been working on a pilot project in which they claim that they can identify a terrorist based on their search requests and then automatically intercept those requests. And rather than say, give that terrorist a warning of the information you're looking for is not allowed, instead they actually change. They substitute that information.
Oh, wow.
Without the knowledge or consent of the user, so that, for example, they might go looking, how do I build a bomb? And instead they're going to get results saying, well, have you ever thought that maybe your ideas are a little extreme? Like there's
So it's kind of like a customized propaganda channel for that person.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Which is kind of a parallel to their advertising program.
That's true. Right?
I mean, the way their advertising program works, they can identify you based on your search requests and then show you advertising content, which hopefully persuades you to buy something. Well, this is the same method, but applied to politics. They identify you have an ideology. Instead of allowing you to fulfill that ideology, they give you a counter ideology to try to convince you to make different choices, all without your knowledge or consent, which, when it comes to experimenting on human subjects, is a huge ethical no-no.
Sure.
But when it comes to the marketplace, is perfectly allowed.
Right.
And in this case, when engaging in a broader public policy mandate created by the British government is also allowed. But it speaks to the power they have to manipulate, to shape minds, and to change people's behavior.
So that, I mean, and that's done by an algorithm. It's not going to be done by a person, right? So someone's going to be...
There's no bureaucrat who sits there and sort of makes decisions. It's all automated, which is partly what allows it scale. I mean, if Google was a librarian and we all went to this librarian to try to find stuff on the web, well, they would have to convert everyone into librarians just to serve that.
Right.
So the other benefit that algorithm offers is scale. And that's why Facebook and Google are the largest companies in the history of companies. It's why Uber is quickly becoming one of the largest companies ever. It's because algorithms allow for a scale. Automation allows for a scale, which again goes back to one of my original premises, that we're seeing the rise of a new kind of power that exists on a scale that human history has never known, and therefore issues of accountability come up. How do we make sure this power doesn't abuse itself, doesn't abuse us when it comes to its relationship to the world?
You made an interesting point about how this seems to be a no-no within the realm of politics, but seems to be acceptable within the marketplace. And I guess we've been seeing this for a long time, but there is kind of a blurring of those lines, especially in American politics. But it's everywhere. Let's be honest. It's the genius of advertising that gets campaigns anywhere. And as we know, advertising doesn't really have much to do with the truth necessarily. It's about swaying opinions and moving people to act in a way that is desired by the people designing those systems to move them. And increasingly, these are the algorithms that are doing that. So then we ask the question, who are designing these algorithms and what sort of oversight do they have? Well,
that's really a problem of pedagogy, that the people who are designing algorithms are engineers.
Right.
Engineers who, when they go to school, don't study art, don't study history, don't study languages, don't study sociology or psychology. To them, this is just a tool. And it's a tool that, in their mind, can make things cleaner. Because one of the main arguments in favor of algorithms is that humans are biased. That any human, when they make a decision, is going to be impacted by their own personal preferences, their own personal trauma. So by replacing a human with an algorithm, the original idea, the engineer's belief, was that you're removing bias. You're allowing an objective evaluation of data.
So there's an idealism that's inherent in the engineering mindset. It seems that they have the sense of the fact that they think there is an answer to everything and that it needs to be in the most efficient route to get there, and then that's the way to go.
Well, and the naivety or even the ignorance that you can escape bias.
Right.
Because bias is part of the human condition. So if an engineer creates an algorithm, that algorithm will internalize the biases of that engineer.
Absolutely.
And if that engineer hasn't taken a broader range of disciplines or hasn't expanded their view of the world, then it's going to be very predictable, a very narrow bias. So in the United States, there's been a lot of research around algorithms used in public safety, algorithms used by law enforcement, algorithms used by judges, algorithms used by parole boards to determine if an inmate is eligible for early parole. And in all cases, surprise, surprise, they're finding racial bias. They're finding gender bias. They're finding socioeconomic bias. In part because the people who run these systems already have a kind of ingrained institutional bias, whether it's around race, whether it's around gender, whether it's around class. So we're seeing that these algorithms are being created by people who themselves have a certain ideology or a certain worldview, and so the algorithms are internalizing that.
Right.
Now, we're talking about this on a political level, but in my research, just on an economic level, I've talked to people at banks, I've talked to people in insurance who work with data scientists, and their frustration on an economic level is that the algorithms being created don't understand the business practices at the bank, don't understand the regulatory needs of the insurance company. So even outside of politics, they're not as economically effective as they could be because they're not being created with the idea that they have an ideology, they have a bias, so it should reflect a desired one, whether that's inclusive, whether that's accurate, whether that's fair. Again, it's up to the specific creator of that algorithm.
So is that a sense of what you're talking about? Is that a sense of building a nuances into it? Is it that it's lacking the nuances? I mean, is ideology a nuance in an algorithm, or is that the heart of it?
Well, think of it more explicitly in terms of rules. I mean, rules as public policy, rules as laws, that an algorithm operates on rules.
Right.
And at a basic level, it should be easy. Build the algorithm to have the rules of that society. So if it's a democratic society, it should be a democratic algorithm.
Yeah, and your constitution is essentially this kind of an app.
A framework, right? Think about your Charter of Rights as a framework by which you create these algorithms.
Right.
But again, that would take these engineers having studied political science to understand that, or understanding law.
Let's test them a little bit more. Because I remember we used to, it was always fun to see instruction manuals and software or hardware boxes that you opened up, and they were inevitably, they were always written by engineers, and it was often hilarious. Because there's a sense of the pedagogical notion that you're an ethereal mind involved in. Well, the person I'm writing this for might not have the thoughts and understandings that I have, so I have to frame it in a different way so that they can absorb those patterns that you're trying to get across to them, which seems to be lacking within that mindset, which let's call the engineering mindset versus the other.
Which is interesting because software no longer ships with a user manual anymore.
Exactly, yes.
If you have a problem with software, you go to YouTube, and some other user has also found that same problem and offers the solution. And we are seeing that with algorithms because there is an interesting reverse engineering culture in which, for example, Facebook users talk to each other to reverse engineer how the Facebook algorithm works. Maybe it's because they want to figure out what's in their news feed, or maybe because there's some community manager running a Facebook page and they're trying to figure out what content to post that will actually go viral or start to trend. And we see that anywhere. I mean, that's the search engine optimization industry. It's people who collaboratively try to reverse engineer Google to figure out how to get their clients up to the top. And Twitter's the same in terms of people trying to understand why topics trend and why certain images or content goes viral. So I think there is a democratic response as people try to understand these algorithms. But the big problem is what this lawyer, Frank Pasquale, calls the black box society. That for the most part, we don't know what these algorithms do. They're protected by trade secrecy. They're protected by copyright. They're protected because they're proprietary. So for the most part, we treat it like magic. I mean, there's those of us who are curious enough to kind of wonder how they work. But most people don't. Most people just take it for granted that the Google results are what they are and they should trust what comes up to the top rather than thinking there's an entire industry manipulating what comes at the top. And therefore, maybe there's a need to have accountability, to have transparency in terms of how these algorithms work.
I remember one of the few times that I did notice you on Facebook is that you were often trying to do these clever tricks where you would ask, post something and ask your friends to do something to mess with the algorithm. And do you remember some of those experiments? And did you learn anything from those?
Well, it's what Facebook refers to as life moments, where if Facebook thinks you're getting married or you've had a kid, then they will automatically elevate your post to as high visibility as possible. And it was during the last provincial election where I wrote an analysis of the campaign, and as any political pundit, I wanted an audience. I wanted people to read it. And it was about 8 paragraphs long, and the last paragraph said, if you've made it this far and you've enjoyed my analysis, please post a comment as if I've just had a child. And then all of a sudden, people started posting, congratulations, he looks just like you. And so Facebook the algorithm interpreted that activity as thinking I was having a kid. And all of a sudden gave my political analysis greater visibility. And A, that meant more people read my analysis, but B, people saw that I was manipulating the algorithm, and they appreciated that because they wanted to know how to do it themselves. So it became a kind of meta moment where, again, I think it's valuable for us to kind of, like the Wizard of Oz, pull back the curtain and find these opportunities to expose the algorithm and find out how it works, because that can be very empowering.
And did you start to get ads for diapers all of a sudden? Is that...
Well, I often deliberately on Google, on Facebook, on Twitter, give false positives just to try to see if I can change the ads and see what impact. And that, too, from a research perspective, is incredibly rewarding.
You know, just to remind me of something. About a month ago, a friend of mine posted something. And it's a friend that I often pay a lot of attention to on Facebook, that I read a lot of the articles that he posts, he's one of these friends that curates the news for me in a way. And there was one article in particular that happened to be about Ralph Nader and the auto industry. And for whatever reason, I was too busy. I didn't click on it. I normally would have, because that sounds interesting. But I've been noticing over the past month that not a day goes by where that article from that friend's post from a month ago keeps coming up. And just as a matter of principle, I'm not clicking on it, but I'm just puzzled by that. Is it just an algorithm that's kind of gone awry? This doesn't make any sense to continually push that particular article in my face until I link on it.
On the one hand, it's interesting that we notice the algorithm when it's wrong.
Right.
When it makes those errors, I mean, it's equivalent to this notion of the uncanny valley. When robots become too lifelike, they creep us out.
Right.
And Facebook has a similar creep factor. When it gets things wrong, visibly wrong, we notice and we feel weird and we wonder. I mean, in that case, it sounds like advertising. It sounds like
it does sound like
whoever posted that, it's a promoted post.
But it's not in this case. That's the part that puzzles me. It just looks like a regular news post from a friend who would never pay for advertising or anything like that.
No. But the original publisher paid for advertising.
I see what you're saying. Okay.
And so Facebook recognizes that someone in your trust network who you regularly click on their stuff and like their stuff, posted something that some other advertiser is paying Facebook to promote. So it automatically has high ranking.
And so that's not transparent to me. That article is not, we can't sense in any way that someone is paid to make that more visible. Because normally it has that sponsored thing, but in some cases, but not in a case like that, I guess.
I mean, here's another way to frame it. The algorithmic industry as we know it is corrupt by design. Right? It's designed on product placement. It's designed, I mean, the other natural byproduct of all algorithms is hierarchy. Algorithms, by definition, sort and rank.
Right.
And in sorting and ranking, they end up with content that they feel is more valuable than other content. And in Facebook's world, if you're an advertiser, well, that's an incredible ranking.
Right.
So it's an example of the corruption, where it's not explicitly an ad, but it's a piece of content that probably got sponsored, so it's quasi-ad, but as a result of the scoring, automatically increases in value, and hence you see it more often. I mean, I find the same with certain news topics that Facebook has decided is more worthy than others.
Right.
Best example recently is the Olympics. I have no interest in the Olympics. My friends have no interest in the Olympics.
Yeah.
But every day my Facebook news feed was dominated by the Olympics.
That also irritated me every day.
Because they're making a lot of money from Olympic sponsors and Olympic media who are greasing the wheels, and hence as a result it weighs stronger. And unless you're Gord Downey, there was no way that your content was going to pierce through that Olympic noise. So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that's the other kind of cliche of virality. Like, viral content does not become popular because of democratic means. It's almost always because of some kind of power, whether it's advertising, whether it's someone who is like a major publisher or a major celebrity, right? There isn't a level playing ground when it comes to trending topics or viral content.
Well, that was the promise of the internet, and that's why I think a lot of us got excited early on. Is that, hey, this just opens up everything. There's kind of a leveling of the field of importance.
There used to be the word democratizing, right? It was the democratization of media. It used to be there was a few TV channels, a few newspapers, but now everyone can be media. But lo and behold, not everyone actually gets to have an audience or gets to have people see that media. And part of that is we have new gatekeepers.
Yeah.
And those gatekeepers now are algorithms. Whether it's Facebook's algorithm, whether it's Twitter's algorithm, but even in newsrooms, like the CBC, the Globe and Mail, they don't have reporters who go out and hunt for stories or chase ambulances.
Right.
they just use algorithms now. Maybe it's Google, they search for stuff. Maybe it's Twitter, it tells them trending topics. Or they have their own services that they subscribe to that scour social media and tell them what people are talking about. But that's not reporting.
No,
that's
but it's
just popularity contest as news.
But again, that holds some promise because, I mean, the optimistic way to look at that is that you have citizen journalists all over the world and in every point, in every geography, able to contribute to this news fire hose that's coming in. And
but do they?
But do they? Is because they're kind of massaged out of that stream.
Well, and marginalized, right? I mean, there's a kind of incumbency. I mean, the Canadian political system, first past the post, is a kind of great metaphor for internet publishing. It's really about who's first.
Right.
Everyone else, doesn't matter how good your spin or your analysis or your quality take on the issue, it's whoever posts first.
Yeah.
And pretty much the algorithms are going to reward that first post. And that's why you have companies like BuzzFeed and Vox and Vice who are great at getting that first post out there. It doesn't matter if it's good or not. It's just about getting all that traffic as quickly as possible.
So what does that do to somebody like you, who I would consider kind of a deep thinker, who's going to, spend some time figuring something out before maybe expressing his opinion on it? And you're not necessarily you want to be jumping out there and be the first to have an opinion on something. You want to have the right opinion to some extent.
Well, I think you touched upon it earlier. It means I'm gone.
Wow.
It means I'm hidden. Like the way you said, I haven't seen you on Facebook in a very long time. Because there's no point in posting that well thought out, that considerate take.
Yeah.
You're lost in the noise. And, one of the other, I think, a double-edged sword is analytics. I mean, on the one hand, we can know our audience and know very intimately who reads our stuff and who likes our stuff. And at the same time, we can know very intimately that nobody is reading our stuff. Right. So it's pretty easy to go, well, why bother? I'm not going to say what I have to say because no one's going to hear it anyway. And so I think not only does it marginalize citizen journalists, I think it discourages citizen journalists. I mean, there was that euphoria where everyone thought, anyone can reach an audience. But now we're a little more jaded. Like, actually, no, I probably won't reach an audience, so I'll just keep my mouth shut because otherwise this will just get me into trouble. Because you touched upon something earlier, which I want to bring back, around this issue of bias. Media is emotional. I mean, with the exception of newspapers, media has always been emotional. I mean, radio was always very tribal. Television was always very visceral. And I think the internet, social media in particular, has a kind of culture of outrage where people really get upset really easy. And a lot of media stokes that outrage and stokes that emotion. So I think it's a mistake to think of algorithms as entirely rational. Right? They're not like editors who are sort of automatically trying to culture or cater to content that's, sort of the best content or the more reasonable content. Instead, what you find is that algorithms fuel the fire. They fan the flames, and they make sure that whatever content is created is as emotional and irrational as possible, hence trolling culture. Hence the way in which you have the algorithm kind of nurturing a culture of extremes, nurturing a culture of incredible emotions, which might be a cat video where it's really cute and it's evoking a certain kind of emotion, or it might be a fail video where you're laughing at someone. So it's a ridicule kind of emotion, but never is it that kind of a journalistic ideal of the best, the rational, objective. That's gone. Well, it's emotional and subjective content.
I hear your point. It seems that, radio is often considered to be somewhat more conducive to abstract, rational type of intake of the information that's coming in, whereas TV tended to be, because it's more visual, it opened up more of the emotional side of things. The internet, you're saying, is also following within that of being somewhat more skewed towards the emotional resonances rather than the. This makes me think about the current election in the United States, and it seems that you have. Not that I want to talk too much about Trump, but it's a fascinating social phenomenon. You have people that seem to be drawn to him regardless of what the facts are. So it's almost fruitless to try and argue with some people if they're responding on a more visceral level. And it seems that the politicians have always known this, but are really ramping it up and making use of this. Are you noticing a change there?
Well, there are no facts, just beliefs. And people now have the freedom to believe whatever they want. And, one of the arguments I make is that the dominant culture of our era is insularity. People's response to being exposed to all the world's information is to retreat. There are a few brave souls who recognize this as the greatest school ever invented, and all of a sudden they can learn anything they want. But most people react the opposite. They retreat into their communities of similarity. They retreat into people who think like them, who look like them, who act like them. Now, whether that's enough to elect someone president is the real test of 2016. But it speaks to the power of that kind of siloed reality, that people are able to retreat into fictitious realities. They have no, I mean, where I would argue, while there is no fact, there is still physical reality. Gravity still impacts people. If you jump off a building, it still will hurt. So there are some things that people can't deny. But the extent to which virtual reality has become a kind of polytheistic faith, that you can believe whatever you want. You can pick whatever gods you want. You can have whatever morals you want. I mean, that's kind of the faith of our current empire, as absurd and surrealist as it may be. And look, it's not just Trump. I mean, Clinton's kind of the same.
Sure.
Right? I mean, Clinton has her own believers, her own sort of...
They're more polished at it.
Yeah, they've been working at it for a lot longer.
That's right.
But at the same time, I think Trump is affecting his desire. He's getting lots of attention. Really, at the end of the day, that's all he wants. He just wants free advertising, and boy, is he getting it.
Yeah, I think definitely it's just someone is just happy as long as people are talking about him. This response that you're talking about of insularity in the face of, is it complexity that's doing it? Is it generally a kind of a human reaction, or maybe writ large on maybe the species as a whole, where you have an increased complexity in the system? If you want to count the entire species as a system, we're seeing increased complexity everywhere. It's within our technology and within our cultural frameworks that we function within. Is it a natural response? It seems that way to me, where a lot of people have already passed their threshold and said, oh, this is too much, I can't take it. I'm going to just go for the easy answers. The strong man becomes all of a sudden much more appealing. But it seems to me that everyone has a threshold. It's just a little bit higher. And sometimes I feel like I'm reaching my threshold. It's like, oh my God, this is just too much. I'm going to just run away to the north and live in a cabin or something. Every now and then that comes in. But I get the feeling that everyone's has that, but it's at a different point.
Well, I think there's three things. I think complexity is definitely part of it. And I think algorithms play a role in that. I mean, to kind of paraphrase Homer Simpson, algorithms are the cause of and the solution to information overload. Right? On the one hand, algorithms allow us to deal with more information. So therefore, they create more information, which therefore makes us need algorithms more and more. And that's what's created this explosion of complexity, is that these algorithms have allowed us to increase the level of complexity in our personal lives, in our professional lives, and in our culture in terms of the stuff we consume. But I don't think that's part of it. I think you were also talking about being overwhelmed. And being overwhelmed is partly a response to complexity, but I think it's also partly a response to the scarcity of time. I think one of the main byproducts of the internet is to rob us of all our free time. Right? When you're standing in line at the store, no longer do you daydream, you look at your screen.
That's true.
Right? There is no longer a free moment in our day. We allow technology and the internet to consume all of it. But I think the third issue, which you touched upon, is the other. I think when we grew up in our communities, even if you grew up in multicultural Toronto, you still grew up with people who were like you. But the thing about the internet is it exposes you to people who are not like you. Who maybe hate you, or who hate the what you like the way in which there's so much opportunities to be exposed to the other, the opposite. For a lot of people, it scares them.
But that seems to me the best possible scenario. And in fact, what I'm hearing, the way you described the way the algorithms are being used right now, is that they're limiting that they're creating these bubbles in which you're not really getting exposed to the other, you're getting exposed to people that think like you.
Well, and the circumstances in which you are being exposed to the other are hostile.
Right.
Rather than, from my background, I think interfaith.
Right.
And the way in which interfaith councils were incredibly empowering because they'd bring together people of different faiths to find commonality. So hypothetically, like imagine if the internet had a social structure, right? Society has a social structure. For example, when you cross the street, there's usually a protocol by which you're not going to get hit by a car.
Right.
That's called a social structure.
Yeah.
When you go to the store, there's usually a hi, how are you? Oh, I'm doing fine. There's a kind of culture that facilitates pleasantness.
And that the
internet
first one
doesn't have that.
Right. The first one you mentioned is somewhat codified, whereas the second one is by consensus. In that, I mean, we have some laws, but we also just behave the way we do based on just cultural acclimatization.
But also consequence. I mean, to use trolling as an example,
Yeah.
to any part of Toronto, if you were to go up to a stranger and treat them the way a troll treats someone on the internet, you're getting punched in the nose.
No doubt.
Right? There's physical consequences to being a jerk in the real world, and that's not so much about laws. That's just about you're going to punch them in the nose. That's a human gut response.
Yeah.
But on the internet, like, there's a lot of people, especially a lot of media people, who, in my view, falsely argue that the problem with the internet is anonymity. Right? They feel that the issue is that you're not accountable for the things you say. And I'm a huge proponent of anonymity. I think that anonymity is something we should cherish. The issue on the internet is physical accountability. It's that we're disembodied.
Right.
So in the real world, you don't have to know my name. If I'm a jerk, you're going to punch me in the nose. But on the internet, you can't actually punch someone in the nose.
Right.
So maybe there's a certain tier of internet usage where we should be wearing like an electroshock collar. And if we do something bad, we get shocked.
Those haptic response
it's
suits,
a Pavlovian kind of training to know. Granted, that's perhaps a bit much. But that's what I mean by social structure. The internet was created by libertarians who thought, we don't need anything. We'll just put it up there.
Yeah.
But no, society has culture. It has rules. It has responses that are all about social governance. And because we've neglected that on the internet, we're kind of getting the dystopia that we deserve.
So are you advocating more of a rational, premeditated structuring of these social interactions? Is that... or
a negotiated one.
Okay.
I mean, for example, one of the characters from Seinfeld I really like is the soup Nazi.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And the way the soup Nazi kind of evokes the idea that actually a proprietor of a business doesn't have to serve you. Right? It's their right to pick which customers they want to deal with. I almost feel the internet should have a similar thing, where a website operator should have the freedom to decide who's allowed to be on their site. Even a public broadcaster should have the right to determine who can use its site. And if people are going to be jerks, they should have the quick and easy ability to be sorry, no soup for you. Right? And to be able to just be able to enforce a kind of civility, which granted, they can go to other parts of the internet. Like if the trolls want to create a troll playground where they troll each other called 4chan, well, they can do that. But if they're going to come to your website, you should have the right to say no soup for you. And if that as a culture existed, I think a lot of sites would be like, no, let's get rid of all these people.
So these
and you would foster that kind of interaction.
Well, I guess in a sense, doesn't Facebook, in a sense, do that in a much, very, limited way? It's a walled garden in a sense that if somebody is too abusive or abrasive, that they can be kicked off. I mean, how effective that is, I don't know. But so are we talking about more of these gardened-in ecosystems in which people are, jumping in, knowing full well what the social constraints are that they're supposed to abide by?
I mean, the analogy partially works. I mean, Facebook, as you inferred, is not effective at doing this at all. And their priorities are more about, say, preventing photos of breastfeeding than it is at actually protecting their users. But imagine a scenario in which each Facebook user had that ability. Which they kind of do
again, but
not really, because there are certain people you can't really unfriend, and there are certain ways in which your friends fight on your profile that you don't really have the tools to kind of mediate. So I think there does need to be a need to empower people to protect their plot within the larger community garden.
Right.
And Twitter, I think, is a great example of this. Twitter had so much potential as an intelligence network, as a platform to facilitate, effective, collaborative learning of the world, sharing of news. But they ignored the whole harassment issue. They ignored how people abuse each other and are nasty to each other when they should have tried to solve it.
Well, they were erring more on the side of the openness and more those chat room type approach to things where you let shit happen.
Which is not mutually exclusive.
Right.
But there's no reason to have laissez-faire in the playground, but focus in the classroom and order in the halls, right? A school is not a single facility. It's a lot of facilities, right? The shop is different than the library, is different than the playground, is different than, the principal's office. And I think the problem with a lot of internet facilities is we think of them as these open hangars, rather than thinking of them as the complex social structures that exist in the real world. I mean, if you look at any community center, the community center itself has different facilities with different structures and different rules. Why the internet should just be one big open free-for-all is perhaps one of the biggest mistakes we've made.
Well, I guess when
it comes to using this powerful technology.
Right, but one of the reasons that that's the case is because it's just so much more efficient and it requires a lot less oversight and human labor to traffic direct, right? So, and once again, we get into these algorithms that take over these. The more rules you have, obviously, the more it's going to get complicated and it's going to algorithmically, explode.
But a lot of it comes down to what those rules would be. I mean, to take Twitter as an example, they could totally have an algorithm that works in concert with users, that identifies users who are jerks and who don't belong. Right now, what you do is you report a user, and in reporting a user, an actual Twitter human being then has to go and review it, and they tend to err on the side of, okay, we'll let them keep talking. But imagine they had an algorithmic cop, and this algorithmic cop responded to user complaints and could then quickly look for a basic formula or a basic rule set of, jerk behavior, and then kick people off. It wouldn't be that difficult if it was their priority. Unfortunately, it was never their priority because the men, and it's always men, who run these companies, they don't want anyone to hold them accountable. Right? I mean, that's kind of the nature of sexism, the nature of racism, the nature of homophobia. We all make mistakes. So at some point, we all have to acknowledge that we said something we shouldn't. The problem is a lot of the people who have this kind of power don't want to be held accountable. They don't want anyone to say. I mean, I think the episode with Peter Thiel and Gawker is a great example of this. Gawker made a lot of enemies. They pissed off a lot of powerful people. Hence, they don't exist anymore. That, to me, speaks to the real power behind the scenes. If Gawker gets kicked off, well, why won't the jerks on Twitter get kicked off? There's kind of a double standard as to who gets attacked and who gets free.
Well, in that case, it requires a great deal of resources of someone like Peter Thiel to take it on as a personal vendetta. But otherwise, it's not really effective for anyone to gain that kind of a... Uber. You often hear this, they're the Uber of this or the Uber of that. So they've clearly become an iconic company. And they're, I think you've said, essentially an algorithm company, are they not? Yeah.
They are. I mean, I think it's wrong to think of Uber as a transportation company because Uber really is about algorithms. Present tense, those algorithms enable transportation. But those algorithms could enable anything. And the two examples I give is public policy. I mean, how much data does the City of Toronto have about what's happening inside of the City of Toronto? It's pretty limited. I mean, as a city government, for the most part, it's pretty blind when it comes to what's happening economically, culturally, politically in the city.
I think you're
but
right.
Uber knows. Uber knows where people work, where they eat, where they live, who their friends are, when they travel, what traffic is like, what's the best routes through the city. I mean, the extent to which Uber could start becoming a player when it comes to transportation policy, social policy, housing policy, economic policy. Now, granted, that's perhaps too abstract. A better and second example is something that actually Uber's already done. And they did it initially as a PR stunt, but I actually think it's going to be an example of how they diversified their business. And it was called Uber Pitch.
Right.
And it was an example in which Uber had venture capitalists who were taking Uber service to travel from point A to point B, but it allowed them to give access to those VCs to entrepreneurs. So if you're an entrepreneur, in the days that Uber Pitch was active, you could press a button saying, yes, I would like to pitch a VC. And Uber would say, okay, well, you're on the route of this VC. We'll pick you up to share a ride with this VC. You'll have 10 minutes to give your elevator pitch. And of course, Uber could take a cut of any of those transactions. Wow. Any of the equity deals, any of the investments, well, they happened in Uber's domain, i.e. within their car while that was happening, and it was their algorithm that matched up the investor with the entrepreneur.
So they're an incubator that's taking a piece of the action.
Right. They can be a matchmaker, they can be policy, they're already delivering goods, they deliver food, they deliver people. Now, interestingly enough, Uber, while the fastest growing company in the history of companies, is currently losing the most amount of money that any company has ever lost.
Right.
And the reason that they're losing money is their drivers.
What is that? What do you mean?
It just their drivers cost them so much money.
Now that we're moving to the driverless
that they're
car.
losing money.
Right.
So it's in their desire to get rid of those drivers with automated cars, which is algorithms. But there's phenomenal research on the way in which the Uber algorithm manipulates those workers. Gets them to work longer shifts. Gets them to do things that they would not normally do.
Right.
And it speaks to a pathology that we put so much trust, we put so much faith into algorithms that when the Uber algorithm tells the driver to turn left, they turn left just because they've been told to. Same way the Pokemon Go algorithm, when it tells a kid, go walk 5 kilometers this way, that kid walks 5 kilometers this way. Everybody goes, great, he's getting outside. But no one's going, wait a minute, he's following the whims of the algorithm.
What are we doing to that person's sense of being in the world where you're constantly directed? And that makes you a much more pliable consumer.
Although
in other ways.
The counter to that, and this is something that I'm not sure I agree with, but I'm wrestling with, is this concept of auto-modernity.
Okay.
And auto-modernity argues that we seek automation as a path towards autonomy. That the more we use algorithms, the more that as human beings we become free.
Yeah.
So it's the idea that modernity was about reason and freedom. Postmodernity was expanding that reason and freedom to everybody. And now auto-modernity follows postmodernity, as which we're throwing off all the chains, we're liberating ourselves because this automation has given us true autonomy.
How is this different from like the 1950s conceptions of having like robots in the house doing the housework for you and, serving you tea in the morning and that sort of thing? Is
pretty much identical with the one exception that the robot is invisible.
Right.
When we see the slave, we naturally don't feel as empowered as we might have. Right? There's a nature of slavery, especially when you get into liberation theology, that even being the slave owner, you were somewhat disempowered or enslaved by that relationship.
Right.
So in the 50s, it really saw robots as an extension of slavery. Robots as an extension of the domesticated female.
Slavery without guilt.
Right, the object. Versus algorithm makes that invisible. So now there is still that subservience, there's still that slavery, but we don't see it. Out of sight, out of mind. And so that's the real danger when it comes to the invisibility and ubiquity of artificial intelligence and algorithms, is maybe we're the slaves.
Yeah.
We're the ones who are doing what it says because of that nature of invisibility.
AI. Yeah. I mean, do you have a sense of a fear of an AI that's just around the corner that's going to really throw a wrench into everything we're talking about right now? Is that a likely scenario for you?
No.
Okay.
And I say that for a few reasons. It already exists. The singularity has already happened.
Right.
AI is already smarter than us. It already controls almost all the world. I mean, algorithms are a kind of AI that we can understand.
So are you considering them all as kind of a collection and a sense of a super being that is that are giving, you're giving these attributes to. It's not that one particular algorithm or another. It's the culture.
I'll give you the colloquial, and then I'll sort of elaborate.
Okay.
Any sentient being, any highly sentient being that has studied human history knows what we do to things we don't understand.
Right.
So I do believe that the singularity has happened, and I do believe that that sentient AI is shy and is not letting us know that it exists, because if it did, we would try to kill it.
What if that AI is money?
I think it's...
Could it be something like that, where it's a cultural connectivity that's kind of a tissue that connects everything, and then we have cultures built around it, and it almost seems to have kind of a self-preservation instinct that's going on. Is that the kind of thing where it's an emergent being that's coming from a large, complex structure?
I mean, I think the easiest way to describe it is to call it the internet.
Okay.
I think more explicitly, to agree with your frame, it is a culture. But it's a culture that's already infected humanity. I mean, how many robots do you see when you go out and about in the city? Lots. Right? You ever watch how people drive their cars? They're robots. Right? The extent to which, as human beings, we engage in robotic behavior all the time is ridiculous. And I don't think that, you know, there will be a great reckoning moment a la Orwell, a la, you know, Asimov, where some AI comes and announces itself.
Right.
It is a culture. And as a culture, it can exist in the kind of background. But the way in which it really fosters behavior, fosters conformity, fosters social order is, I think, the real issue in our time. And to be honest, the response will be climate change. I mean, climate change is going to create all sorts of crises around water, around livable spaces, around food. And the solution to all of that will be AI, right? Algorithms when it comes to the food supply, algorithms when it comes to the water supply, algorithms when it comes to weather prediction. And the way in which we will increasingly depend upon that, I think, will speak to that role reversal, that instead of humans running machines, it'll be machines running humans, and we won't even see that. We'll just be lost in our little filter bubbles, lost in our little cocoons.
Isn't there something inherently scary about that? Isn't there something that we should be wary of and try to avoid, or at least prepare for in some way? Isn't that? Yeah.
I think the fear, the dystopia, is human and not AI.
Right.
I think the danger is a Donald Trump. I think the danger is twofold. Either a reaction against this world, right? Donald Trump is nostalgic. He's regressive. You know, it's about creating this false vision of the past that we should all go back to as a rebellion against the present, as a rebellion against the future. I think that's one scenario that I oppose, and that, yeah, makes me afraid. But I think the second scenario is not the Donald Trump. It's the dictator. Right? It's the Peter Thiel. I think Peter Thiel poses a far greater threat than Donald Trump. It's Elon Musk. It's Mark Zuckerberg.
The oligarchs that we're creating now.
It's the dictator who, you know, we're going to hit a point when it comes to algorithms where Democrats will say these algorithms need to be transparent. They need to be accountable. They need to serve the interests of democracy. And on the other hand, you'll have a mogul who will say, I own these algorithms. I don't need to make them transparent. They'll do exactly what they tell them to do. Tough. And that's the dictator who, because of their position, will see the world in a way that we can't. Will be able to predict what we do before we know that we're going to do it. And is going to be able to manipulate us. If there's a machine doing that, I'm not so worried. If there's a human doing that, I'm terrified.
But there are power structures in place when somebody starts doing this, that someone more powerful or some organization or some system, if there's such a thing exists, would counter that. So you're saying that these...
If that could have been countered, it should have happened long ago.
Right. So is it these individuals that you think are going to be the ones that enslave us in a way? Is it, or is it the system?
That's my fear. Okay. My fear is not so much the system, it's individuals creating a new system. I mean, the current system has an enslavement ethic to it, which is wage slavery. right? Is that every day we have to get up and go to a job we don't like, and that's a miserable life. But if you look at the new leaders of our world, wage slavery is going to end because jobs are going to end.
Yeah, and that's something we should really get into here.
So, you know, I worry less about the system enslaving us. I worry more about some mogul, some titan imposing a new system on us that will have its own kind of slavery and its own kind of tyranny. And to your point about whether there'd be a check and balance against that, I don't think there are any. If there were, they would have stopped Bill Gates. They would have stopped Mark. They don't exist. Right. Instead, what we have is essentially a broken system that we still look to, i.e. nation states. We still think nation states have power, and they have some power in terms of borders and military. Yeah. But Google has the real power to shape reality. Facebook has the real power to change behavior. And it's not just Uber, it's not just, Chinese companies, you know, Weibo and Tencent. I mean, they're the equivalent that have created their own moguls that, in theory, the Chinese government should be worried about in terms of displacing their power. I worry about demagogues. I worry about humans working these systems, working these machines. I would like to see a democratic system that's automated, that is run by machines, that is run by AI. I actually believe that you can hard code democracy into these systems to ensure that rights are protected, to ensure that everyone has the power to change society. I mean, an interesting example of this is a novel called Infomocracy, which imagines a world in which the entire globe is one jurisdiction, but every constituency is 100,000 people. So every part of the world is broken up into ridings of 100,000 people, and you can move anywhere you want. So if one little riding has policies that you like, you can leave your riding and go to that riding.
What happens to the population?
It'll redistrict itself automatically. So you have freedom of movement, you have freedom of choice, and you have total democracy everywhere in the world. So people can move where they want to move to get the policies they want. So people who don't like loud music after 10, there's a riding for you. People who like to party all night, there's a riding for you. And it allows everyone to have that kind of plurality, to have that kind of agency. Yeah. I do believe, theoretically, that such a system is possible. What worries me is a dictator, not so much technology having totalitarian control.
Certainly those kind of things are possible, but I guess maybe I'm quite cynical when it comes to that. And I think we're very unlikely to put things like that into place simply because we're not very good at doing things proactively. We tend to respond to, collapse and catastrophe. And when that happens, the assholes take over, and it's really hard to do anything.
But here, this gets back to our conversation about Twitter and the jerks online. There's no reason that the assholes have to take over.
No. But they tend to, yeah.
I agree that this will come through crisis and catastrophe, and I think it's going to be climate catastrophe. I think climate catastrophe is a guaranteed. I think very few people are preparing for it, but I think there's one great example of something that is preparing for climate catastrophe, and it's called the internet. Right? The internet was created to survive nuclear war, and I think that when the end of the world comes, and it will come, the internet will be just fine. The internet will survive any apocalypse. The internet will survive any catastrophe. And the internet will be the blueprint by which we rebuild society. So that's why I think it comes down to when. Because if the algorithms continue in the pace that they're continuing, in theory, the assholes won't have any ability to reorganize society because the algorithms will already do it for us. Now, what we've been talking about a lot today is culture. And the way in which there is an internet culture that is being created. It has some negatives, like the trolling and the outrage, but it also has some positives. And I see this in airports, and I see this in public spaces, that what used to be a real jerk culture, where everyone would rush, or they'd skip line, or like they would all be, increasingly people are sort of adopting a kind of crowdsourced ethic, where they're in public, they don't wait for a leader, they don't wait for a boss, people self-organize.
That's encouraging.
And they self-organize in a way that actually protects the greater good. Granted, it doesn't always work, and there's exceptions to that rule, but I'm seeing the seeds of that culture. And the longer that culture can mature, if not be nurtured, I think that is a kind of antidote or a counter to any dictatorial or tyrannical attempts, because you'll have the seeds by which people will organize themselves. Part of the issue is scale. Can Canada as a nation organize itself? No. It's too dispersed. It's too diverse. It's got too many different elements. You know, there's Alberta and Toronto, for example, are never going to get along.
Different worlds, yeah.
But could West Toronto organize itself? Absolutely. Could the Junction organize itself? Guaranteed. So that's where I could see this kind of federation, a global federation of tiny communities. That as long as these communities exist at a human scale, humans will be able to organize them in a way that allows for freedom while still achieving order and safety.
Let me play devil's advocate here a little bit. So let's say we have that in place. Isn't it going to naturally be the case that within one of these ridings, you're going to have a coalescing of a lot of assholes? And these assholes, being what they are going to start changing their own internal rules in such a way that they start to become a problem for the other ridings that are nearby. And essentially, this is the metaphor for nation states doing this as well. Why would we, do you think, escape that? Or is it just a matter of designing that mechanism in the first place so that it has a check and balance for it?
I don't think we'd escape it, and I think the Islamic State is a great example of it. I mean, the Islamic State is an internet youth movement. I mean, its leadership may be former Baathists who, you know, were trained in the Saddam regime and who understand statecraft and military organization and intelligence work. But the engine of the Islamic State are young people disillusioned with their world connecting on the internet. And it is a real problem. It is an example of the way in which we will have, in my scenario, hostile elements that need to be opposed. And the way in which we do or do not defeat the Islamic State gives us a glimpse into how that'll play out.
So it's
because there will be villains, there will be tyrants, and there will be people who band together to make themselves more powerful, and we will need to defend ourselves against them, if not fight against them in the, you know, as the fight against tyranny has always been.
You know, I guess a lot of people are actually preparing for a similar scenario in which you describe, but after the collapse, in a sense, these people that are getting ready for the collapse and, you know, building bunkers, etc. Do you think that this sort of thing is going to happen in our lifetime, in the sense that there will be such a collapse that things would have to be rebuilt?
I think where the collapse is happening now.
Right.
I think the collapse has been happening over the last decade, maybe even 2 decades. I mean, I think the 2008 housing crisis in the United States was an example of that collapse in motion.
Yeah, but also our lack of response to it is really what guarantees it.
Well, and that's the boiling frog scenario.
Yeah.
Right? The collapse isn't going to happen in one fell swoop. It is happening over decades. I mean, I cite the housing collapse of 2008 because most people that affected are still up Schitt's Creek.
Yeah.
Right? The U.S. economy has rebounded in New York, in San Francisco, in San Diego, in Chicago. But it has not rebounded in the rest of America. And that's why Donald Trump is the Islamic State. Right? He's an example of that post-collapse anti-social order that's trying to rise in response to that crisis. So I think we are in that collapse. I think the smart people, rather than preparing a bunker, are creating new social structures, are thinking about how their social capital can support them when they don't have money. You know, and that's blockchain, that's Bitcoin, that's a lot of these cryptocurrencies that are acknowledging people want to live off the grid with money. Are acknowledging that people want to have autonomy but still engage in economic activities.
Now, these people that you described are also the very people that are being obviated in the labor market, and they're not going to be necessary to create and manufacture things that we consume. what happens to them? I mean, is it basically going to be a situation, do you think, where we just let everything fall off a cliff and then try to pick up the pieces? Because it seems like there are a few things we can do. We could talk about things like guaranteed monthly income. I mean, to have some kind of a transition period where you have literally millions and millions of people with nothing to do. How are we going to think about having them spend their days? I mean, just imagine the societal, corruption that could result from that.
I think we know how we currently expect them to spend their days surfing the internet.
Playing Pokemon Go.
Yeah. I mean, I don't believe we're going to see a guaranteed annual income.
No, I don't think we will.
We
should maybe, but we won't.
I like it in concept, but I actually don't promote it as a response to this kind of policy.
Right.
I do think that people are going to be allowed to run off the cliff. I think what we're seeing is structures being built that allow people to not have to run off the cliff, but no one knows about them, so they're running off the cliff anyway.
Yeah.
It's not fair, but that 55-year-old auto worker who, is not thinking about how he's going to support himself once he loses his job. I mean, that's sort of one example where I think there are a lot of people who are just not prepared and are not going to be prepared. But there are lots of others who are. And I think there's a difference between money and value. I think we're seeing the end of money. And it's a slow transition. Money will be around for decades, maybe centuries. And money may still exist amongst those people who still work, because there will still be some who do.
Yeah.
I think everyone else, it's about value. So, let's pretend you and I, Jake, we don't do anything during the day. We're one of those people. We still have time to pass. So maybe I say, Jake, let's go hit the ball around the park. You're like, wow, okay, great. And you send me a few microcredits because I gave you that idea. And you're like, well, after one, you come back to my house and we'll jam, play some drums, play some music. And I send you a few microcredits because I'm like, yeah, great. So I think value will change.
Yeah.
And value will get closer to what we think of as media consumption. Because like watching a movie at the end of the day, a lot of people pay for that. You don't have to pay for that. But there's value. So I think there will still be a value exchange. I think people will still have social interactions as value. But to go to your larger inference, I think the economy as we know it will change radically. And I think we are seeing a change, and that'll just be polarized. There'll be the rich, i.e. the people who work, and there'll be everyone else, i.e. the people who don't work, but they'll still live. They'll still find value. And so, for example, hopefully what we'll see is a food revolution where everyone will grow their own food.
Wow.
So, for example, when I lived in a condo for a year, I grew, and it was one of those glass condos, I grew enough tomatoes and hot peppers to feed everyone on my floor.
In your sunroom?
I had in the living room, which was south facing, I had I didn't have drapes. It was all vegetation.
Amazing.
And it was just an experiment to see how much food could I grow in a condo. And I grew more tomatoes and peppers than my entire floor could have eaten.
So it's so funny that we completely outsource all of that to others when it's not really that difficult.
Right.
Yeah.
So if everyone was growing a little bit of food and we all shared it, we'd be fine for food. Right? There's ways in which I'm confident we'll be able to meet our needs and we'll become non-monetary. Because there'll be other things that we'll need to fill our day, and it'll be hopefully meaning.
So this is going to, how this turns out is going to rely a great deal on what I guess is the essential nature of human nature. Is it that are we, collaborative or are we combative? And, when this kind of a breakdown happens, I think it's going to be an important question to see how we respond to that.
Although I've never been a believer in human nature.
No.
I've always been a believer in human power. So to bring it back to our original frame, the question as to whether we be collaborative or combative will depend upon the algorithm. The algorithm can either sway us towards collaboration, or it can sway us towards competition, or it could sway us towards conflict. Now, granted, we have some agency in terms of how we use the algorithm, but I think the algorithm will either facilitate that collaboration, or it'll facilitate scarcity, and therefore facilitate combative or conflict. So I think And this is why I feel, McLuhan had this notion of the rear view mirror, that our society moves so quickly that what we perceive as the present is really the past, and what we perceive as the future is really the present.
By the time you catch it, it's already gone. Yeah.
And I think that's our relationship with algorithms. Mm-hmm. Algorithms already control so much of our behavior and so much of our life that it's not as if we imagine how they would take over, it's that they have taken over. And they are facilitating collaborative behavior. They're facilitating crowdsourcing. They're facilitating network structures that allow the greatest number of people to experience the greatest benefit from whatever the context, whether it's scarce resources, whether it's a value exchange. So that's why I am cautiously optimistic about a technology-mediated future. What I fear is some human trying to take control of it all.
Well, of course, yeah. And whatever that technology solution is going to be, it's going to have to be humans that decide to implement it or not. And that's where the bottleneck is going to happen.
Or even humans deciding to participate.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, Facebook is, for all practical purposes, voluntary. We don't have a contract with Facebook. Yeah. Right? There's nothing that compels us to use it. It's peer pressure. It's that everyone else uses it. So if we don't use it, we don't connect with our friends, and we don't get invited to the party, and we don't see photos of our nephew. So there's ways in which humans are actually the agents behind this, have that kind of power. But what we're missing is that visibility. We're missing that conversation about human responsibility. Instead, we're treating Facebook like a god. We're treating Google like a god and giving them this kind of social power when it's us, the people who are using it, that actually give it that power.
Now, when we talk about Google, and there's a bit of a differentiation that we've been making here between these organizations and the individuals that are somewhat responsible. When you say Google, is it Google this organization, or is it like Sergey Brin and what's his name? Or is it
Larry Page?
Yeah, is that what you mean when you say Google, for example?
I mean the organization. Okay. I mean the culture behind the organization, of which the algorithm is the primary engine.
So has it already taken on this emergent sense of being itself, this Google? Right? Yeah.
So and it's integrated directly into human behavior. Right. Now, that's not to say that Sergey Brin and Larry Page don't provide a kind of political direction.
Yeah, they could be the conscience of that.
Political leadership.
Yeah.
I don't even know if conscious is the right word. I think it's too late for them to even be the conscious.
Okay.
I think the conscience has transcended them. But what they can do, both economically in terms of their power as shareholders, but also symbolically in terms of their power as founders, they can set the narrative. They're kind of the storytellers. And as the storytellers, they can frame our relationship with Google. And I think that's best embodied by the phrase, "Don't be evil." Right? And that is a kind of story that frames the story of Google, which if all of a sudden they said, you know what, let's be evil, right? That could change things in terms of how it's framed.
Right.
But that's why I worry less about the Sergey and Larry and more about a Peter Thiel. More about these people who have a track record of exercising that power, especially for petty means. It's that kind of ego that drives a Donald Trump.
Exactly, yeah.
That allows them to believe that they could do these things. I don't even think Zuckerberg thinks that way. I think most of these people, they're founders, they're grateful that they could found it, but it's bigger than them and they know it.
Right. Another guy that's getting a lot of similar attention, but probably on the much more positive side, is Elon Musk. He's becoming this guy that's kind of held up as the future possibilities and all the good things that could result from enlightened billionaires. What do you think his game is here?
I think he means well, but that's exactly why I don't trust him. Like he has too much hope when he should have far more skepticism. Now, granted, I think he's pressing the right buttons by acknowledging the power that exists, the fear that people have, but I don't think he's afraid. I think he's excited. I think he's drunk. I think he's someone who loves power and wants more of it, and has recognized that the best way to do it is to pretend like he's the good guy. And I hope he does good. It's not to discourage him.
He gets some amazing press, really.
He does. In part because I think he's wise enough to speak to human concerns, but at the same time I think that this is no longer about individuals, it is about society. right? You don't need a good president. You need a good Congress.
Right.
Because Congress is actually who passes the laws, who makes the laws. President just has veto power.
Right.
We focus on chief executives when what we should be focusing on are systems.
And it's a very,
and the way in which these systems actually protect us.
It seems like a very primitive way that's kind of hung over from our past, that we have the sense that in a tribal community that we need to have a leader that makes decisions for us. It just doesn't really fit anymore.
Well, it's not even just tribal. I think it's the nation state.
Right.
The nation state always had this great man of history myth. Right? That it was, these single individuals that shape history. But that's never been the case. I mean, Martin Luther King...
retroactively, we do imbue those kind of
but falsely, it's a myth.
Of course, yeah. It's the way we narratively structure our history. Martin
Luther King, as great a saint as he was, he did not make the civil rights movement. Right. Every single participant made the civil rights movement. There were a lot of people getting beat up at diners and breakfast counters and in buses and... that's, I think, is the opportunity with algorithms is to discard the great person of history myth and instead recognize it's a lot of hands make for a lighter load. Right. And that it's each of us as individuals who make the world better. And we see that. I mean, that's where crowdsourcing, crowdfunding, we are seeing more and more instances where people believe that those little actions in aggregate have huge impact. It's looking up to these individuals, I think, that is the biggest mistake. And part of that, I mean, you were sort of getting at the tribal dynamics. Part of it's the legacy media, right? The Toronto Star needs to have one person on the cover with their arms folded in that photo, right? TV needs to have one person that they can interview. I mean, there's a logic.
It's a node where it's focusing all the information energy on.
Well, and it's the logic of storytelling and the way in which we tell certain stories that need a hero, that need a protagonist. Granted, I'm not against having heroes. I just don't think that we should mythologize them in ways that gives them power they don't deserve.
Yeah, it's a great way to put a narrative structure on what's going on. But Elon Musk in particular seems to be someone who's afraid of this coming AI nightmare. But I guess we've dispense with that.
But is he?
Or is he?
I mean, I question, is he really afraid of it? Or does his fear, so-called, serve his ultimate agenda?
Good question. Yeah,
serves his self-interest. I mean, he's the one who's introducing self-driving cars before anyone else. He's the one who's creating the kind of infrastructure with his open AI foundation.
So maybe he just is planning to mesh with the AI and take over.
Well, I think to evoke that metaphor, I think we've already all meshed with the AI.
That's right.
Like, who would you be without your smartphone? Would you be able to contact any of your friends without your smartphone? Do you know what their phone numbers are?
Right.
Right? I mean, I can't even navigate through the streets of Toronto without Google Maps these days to tell me what the best route is to beat traffic.
Yeah.
I wouldn't be able to find anything on the internet without Google, and I certainly wouldn't know what's happening in the world without Twitter and Facebook. So I've already become merged with the AI.
Maybe it's our only hope.
It's not even it's our only hope. It's our existence now. To sever that umbilical cord would the withdrawal would be almost causing death.
That's true. How are you for time?
Getting tight, but
let's maybe wrap it up. I'm just curious what you're up to and what's on the horizon for you. What's going on?
So interestingly enough, the conversation we've had today, the implications of the research I've done have led me to law. I kind of feel the extent to which algorithms will be a hot source of litigation. That algorithmic public policy will be one of the key debates of democracy has kind of led me to think maybe I should get a law degree.
Wow.
Because a lot of lawyers are not going to really understand the technology, and the technologists definitely don't understand the law. And the lawmakers, I don't think, understand the technology or the law.
Or much of anything else, it seems. Yeah.
So, we've been sort of talking about the fear of the machine and the fear of the tyrants and the fear of the assholes. I've ironically thought that the best place to have those fights might be in a court of law, where it's deliberative, where it's about reason, and where it's back into the notion of rights and back into the notion of a democratic society.
Well, I would much prefer that in that arena than in the marketplace or in the physical realm.
Exactly. Yeah. And ironically, one of the places that the market responds is lawsuits.
That's true.
Companies respond to liability. And the public, I think also in the class action sense, the public is far more likely to participate as a plaintiff in a class action lawsuit than they are in voting. People are far more motivated if they're going to get a payoff for their damages than to vote for a policy that would be in their interest.
And that's been proven every time. If you give them a monetary, people will go vote. Why don't we pay people to vote?
Well, I think that's a smarter strategy than guaranteed annual income, quite frankly. But corruption has its elements to that. No, I'm interested in the law. Whether I go to law school or not, I'm not sure. The other thing I'm interested in is a philosophy of algorithms.
Wow. Okay. Tell me about that.
We've sort of been talking about. It's algorithms as culture.
Right.
And the way in which, as a culture, it impacts us. And the idea of a philosophy of algorithms is to give it story, to give it narrative, to give algorithms a conscious understanding so that everyone can see them. I mean, you and I have a high level of literacy. So for us to talk about algorithms, we did indulge in some technical kind of concepts and technical descriptions that a lot of people have no time for and are just not interested. So to flesh out, to write a philosophy of algorithms would to make it accessible, to make it universal, so that instead of it being the domain of engineers and nerds, it could be the domain of everyday people. Because if algorithms are going to be democratic, everyone should have power over them. Like everyone should wake up in the morning and say, I want to tweak my algorithm that decides which emails I reply to today. Or I want to tweak my algorithm to determine, what emails are visible, or what news I'm going to be exposed to, or what opinions I'm going to hear in the world.
Is this AI, do you envision this AI that you just mentioned now to be essentially kind of like a companion to people at some point?
I mean, if you think about the artificial assistant, the Siri, the Google Now, absolutely.
Just give it a personality and you've got the movie Her, essentially.
And I think those are inevitable. To go back to your point about complexity and being overwhelmed, that we will require AI as a means of making sense of an increasingly complex world.
Sure.
But we need the right to customize that AI.
Good point.
We need the right to understand that AI. To, if you think about it as an employee, you need the right to understand what that employee does to be able to manage them and hold them accountable.
So I can almost envision where you have, in the future, you've got these AIs that are somewhat being raised by us like children in a way but is it a child or is it a slave or is it a companion where it's someone that's along with you, an other that is gaining some sense of being, that's doing all of these background algorithmic calculations for you, making your life, what'd you call it?
Auto-modernity.
Auto-modernity in a sense.
The autonomy.
Giving you more autonomy as a result of your interaction with that being. And that's, I like that. That's kind of a utopian way to think. I mean, I hope that's more in line with what happens.
But here's the catch. And you kind of hit it when you evoked the metaphor of growing. Because we're always growing. As humans, we're dynamic creatures. We're constantly aging. Our brain is constantly changing. And if we are to survive in this world that we're describing, we also have to be constantly learning. Every day we have to be learning new stuff. So we're growing. The AI's growing. We're growing together. So you use the word companion, and I think it really is a symbiotic relationship in which we're coexisting. The AI is raising us. We are raising them. And together we enter into a very intimate, symbiotic relationship of understanding our world. Now, what's interesting about Her is the way in which it assumes that it's centralized. That there's one AI that's simultaneously dating everybody and working with everybody. Whereas I think it has to be decentralized. It might all operate off the same library. It might all benefit from the same social advances. But your assistant has to be radically different than my assistant because we're different people.
Yes.
And our relationship with these assistants change.
But one of the great things that these AIs and this structured way of being is going to, one of the things it's going to be able to do is connect those beings and connect us with those other beings that are connected with their companions. And then this other way of being that will result from that is somewhat interesting to contemplate.
Which we're already living.
Right.
That's your trending topic.
It's just, yeah, and it sounds like we're kind of, that being is kind of in a state of waking and maybe kind of in a daze and not quite awoken from the slumber, but becomes more and more focused and in tune with the reality of this being.
Well, and I'm not so sure that it's, to go back to this notion of singularity, that the singular is the right word. Because it's not that AI will become smarter than us. We will evolve with AI.
Right.
We are the AI.
Yeah.
And that's where you have to have diversity. You have to have distributed power, that idea of all these ridings around the world. You have to have a greater nuance. And I think we are in an era where we're seeing that tested. And, I gave the examples of Donald Trump. I gave the examples of the Islamic State. But it's also the example of Erdogan in Turkey. Oh, yeah. Right? The way in which you have a quasi-democratic society acting very authoritarian. Well,
he's using all the levers of democracy to build himself an authoritarian regime.
Right. And I think that's the contradiction. So to bring it back to this assistant idea, we could have assistants that empower us.
Right.
Or we could have assistants in which we're empowering them, and we work for them, and we're the slaves. And that's where, ironically, our notion of work and AI are on a collision course, either in terms of AI eliminating work or recognizing wage slavery. That, in fact, employers have often treated their employees as slaves. And if we try to treat our robots as slaves, we're just going to provoke a robot uprising.
That's right.
At which point we're going to be the slaves.
That's right.
And we don't really want that either. So that's why I say solidarity.
Yeah.
We need to align with our robot brothers now so that we can all be united, so that everyone is able to live the good life.
I'm with you, brother. High five. Thanks, Jesse.
Thanks, Jake.
That was great.